and welcome to this Astranti YouTube video looking at the examiner's report, the examiner's feedback on the May 2020 Strategic Case Study exam. And if you do like this video and you want to see more videos relating to the strategic case study, then please like and subscribe at the bottom of the screen, as we will be releasing more videos in the run-up to the case study exam. And this particular examiner's report details the May 2020 exam. And what's unique about this examiner's report compared to all the other reports they have released in the past is this is the first time that CIMA has used the same pre-scene for two case study exams. So it should provide some really useful information for those of you sitting in August 2020, because this is actually information based on candidates who have already sat an exam based on this pre-scene. But what it does say here is that if you are resitting, you do not need to retain any knowledge, any information based on the May 2020 exam. It's not going to build upon that. It's not going to ask you the same questions, etc. And on that note, CIMA have been quite vague in terms of the information provided here. They're not talking about the actual specific questions that have come up, etc., because that would be giving you too much information. So you have to take this exam as if it hadn't been done before, as if there wasn't a May 2020. Everything starts with a clean slate again. Just because a question came up in May doesn't mean it's going to come up again or isn't going to come up in August, etc. And so let's start by looking at the general comments. This is a general overview of basically the case study, and also where students did well, where they didn't do so well, and what the good students, the performing students did, and what the students who didn't perform very well did as well. Because you want to learn from the students that did well, but you also want to learn from the students who were unsuccessful, because you don't want to be one of those students in the exam when you sit it in August. So let's take a look at some of these comments here. Of course, as I'm sure you already know by now, the case study is based on Runabout, a company that provides micro-mobility services. So things talking about the last mile. So we use hoverboards here at Runabout, but there are also other companies that provide electronic scooters, electronic bicycles, and traditional pedal-powered bicycles. Ultimately, it's just providing almost a service of being able to rent these devices to go short distances in city centres. And in the real world, the actual industry is growing and developing in a number of different ways. And a good student should be able to identify this concept. They should be able to understand what this particular industry is about and how people actually use these particular devices, rather than just knowing about them from a very theoretical, textbooky perspective. You need to know how people actually use them, why they actually use them, what they expect from the service. Also, you need to know about how they are paid for, using accounts, using credit cards, etc., and how that links in with IT systems, because IT systems and data security is very important, both in a general sense and a real world sense. There's been data breaches at micro-mobility companies such as Uber, and also at large companies such as British Airways. And also you should know about the alternatives for this. You should be able to suggest alternatives. Think about what other companies have done to get around these whole ideas of credit cards. Maybe that's by using a PayPal type system, or using an Oyster card type system like Transport for London uses. And the questions that you will be asked in the exam, they all are based around the strategic case study blueprint, which details these core activities. So you have the develop business strategy, the evaluate the business ecosystem, recommend financing strategies, evaluate and mitigate risk, and recommend and maintain a sound control environment. And there are a series of I can statements for each of these, and I do advise that all students do take a look at those I can statements. Think of them as a checklist. look through them and ask yourself, can you do that? Can you turn around and say, yes, I can do X, Y, Z? Because if you can't turn around and say that, the chances are you need to refresh your memory of those particular subjects, because you will need to be able to answer those statements in the exam. So let's look at the particular comments on these different I can statements, and the exams report is broken down by the students that did well in those particular activities and the students that did not do so well in those particular activities. And just as an aside, the actual requirements for passing this exam are based on your overall performance. It's not based on an individual core activity performance. That's where it does differ from the old syllabus, where you had to meet a minimum standard in each competence. You can, in theory, pass this exam by getting 100% in 4 core activities and 0% in another. But it's best to perform well in every core activity, because there will be at least 15 to 25% of your marks in your exam from each of these core activities. So let's start with develop business strategy. And this is all about the ability of the student to identify the current position of the company and identify whether the strategy is realistic or not, and make realistic recommendations. And the exams report essentially says here that the best performing candidates, the strong candidates, were able to identify the strategy and able to offer realistic suggestions for the change in direction. So think about what an actual company, an actual micro-mobility company would do in this position. And if you can't think of an actual company that would actually do what you're about to suggest, then perhaps it's not realistic. Often students, they pen themselves in based on what they're given in the pre-scene. The pre-scene says we're a hoverboard company, therefore we should only ever be doing something about hoverboards. Oh, you're suggesting going into scooters. Well, that's not what we're doing, so let's not do that. But in reality, lots of micromobility companies offer various different devices, so it's perfectly realistic to suggest moving into scooters. Also, if you start suggesting that they buy a football club, well, how many micromobility companies are purchasing football clubs? Is that something that ties in with their mission statement, ties in with the way that they operate? No. Can you imagine Lime or Bird suddenly purchasing an NBA basketball team? No. So don't suggest it, because that's not being realistic, and you are not then demonstrating yourself as someone who can develop effective business strategy. So what you must be able to do in this exam is to analyze proposals and evaluate potential changes and offer effective opinions and arguments, justifications for what you are about to express. There's no right or wrong answer here. That you don't have to say, yes, this is a good idea, what you're suggesting, or no, this is not a good idea, and you only get marks if you choose the right one. It's all about how you reason and how you argue. As long as your point is realistic, it's thought out, you're considering the strategy of the company, you're considering the stakeholders of the company, how feasible it is for the company, then you will earn marks. Whereas the weak candidates, with regards to this particular core activity, they often missed the new information. They didn't put that information into their answers. They didn't adapt their understanding of the strategy to the changing circumstances. You might be thinking, well, what does the examiner mean by this? Well, in the exam, you are given unseen information. You're given information for the first time in the actual exam. And often this information might contradict, or it might go down a slightly different direction than what the pre-scene was suggesting, or what you thought the pre-scene was suggesting, or what you thought was going to be the case for the exam. And in this instance, you are to take the unseen information. The unseen information is the important information. That's the information you are being examined on. The pre-scene is just background context. If something contradicts the pre-scene, don't just go with your pre-scene knowledge. You have to tailor your answer around the unseen information. So everything that they give you in the actual exam has to be read, understood, and implemented into your answer. So make sure you incorporate new information into your answers. Don't just answer questions based on your pre-scene knowledge. Then on to evaluate the business ecosystem, the business environment. So this is where we're thinking about the stakeholders of the organization. We're thinking about the greater business industry in which it operates. And you can see here that the good candidates, the stronger candidates, are factoring in the stakeholders. They're factoring in how the stakeholders are going to react to it. And a good student will always consider all stakeholders. Not to say that we have to go with what's best for all stakeholders, because that's often impossible. What's good for one is often not good for another. So in that case, you then have to factor in your stakeholder satisficing. And you have to consider the power, consider the influence of your stakeholders, and go towards the one that has the most power, that has the most influence. Because someone that has no power, no influence, and doesn't really care, you don't need to go out of your way to fulfill their needs, because they don't care and they have no power anyway. You have to fulfill the ones that are powerful, the ones that are interested. And again, tying back to the first core activity, good students able to make realistic recommendations that reflect the situation. So again, thinking back to the real world, thinking back to what actually companies in this position actually do. Don't just make really outrageous statements based on theoretical knowledge. I've had scripts before where there's been small companies and there's a good opportunity that comes up. And rather than perhaps just organically trying to move into it, they suggest, let's buy one of the major companies in that. Let's go to the bank and get a $500 million loan and buy one of these major competitors. Well, it's a small company that's worth less than 100 million. What bank is going to give that company $500 million in a loan? No bank would. So that's not a realistic recommendation. Think about the industry that you're in. If you're a small company, you have to act like a small company. If you're a large company like Runabout, you can act like a large company. Don't make recommendations that don't fit the company. And some candidates often use practical examples, real-world cases involving micromobility companies. And this is something that CIMA do want you to do and suggest that you do regularly. But make sure that they are realistic, make sure they are relevant. Don't just try and cram in examples for the sake of it. If they're not actually relevant to the question, they're not relevant to the point you are trying to make, then leave them out. Because it does demonstrate to the examiner that you are perhaps just trying to extend your answer, and also you're not answering the question that's being asked. And CIMA really want you to answer the question that's being asked. Don't try to answer the question you wish you were answering. You have to answer the specific question being asked. And then on to recommend financial strategies. We're looking more at your F3 material here. And most candidates are aware of the theory of finance decisions. Of course, you've all studied F3 recently. But the best candidates adapt their understanding. They base it around the economic needs, the financial needs, the funding needs of Runabout of the company. So they look at the gearing rate of the company. The gearing rate's quite high. Do we need to raise additional finance through gearing, or will we need to, through debt, or will we need to do it through equity because of our high gearing? But then DocBike, our competitor, has a similar gearing level, and therefore that could be the way in which the industry is more of an industry standard. But then if we raise finance through equity, it's going to be very expensive. It's going to take a long time. Our shareholders might not like it because it might dilute their holdings and their dividends, etc. So they might not want to do it. So again, you're tying that knowledge back to the actual environment, the question, the company, rather than just saying that, oh, there are a number of ways in which organizations can raise finance. They can raise finance through this. The advantages of this way are such and such, which is what the weaker answers tended to do. They repeated information from their study text, very theoretical. Again, you should see this theme that is coming through here, that everything is based on the specific issues, the specific needs of the company. If it's not relevant to the company, then don't talk about that. Again, I've seen scripts where it's been a private company and they said, raise additional funds for a rights issue. Well, they're going to raise additional funds for a rights issue and they're not a traded company that doesn't have existing shareholders. Again, it's just using textbook knowledge rather than applying it. Poor answers rely on theory. Good answers have application. The best answers have effective use of theory where they're tying it back to the company and evaluating the company's position. And the same for risk. You need to recognize the specific risks that are affecting the company, the ones that are actually affecting runabout, and also recognize the severity of risks. Perhaps think about which risks you want to prioritize. What ones are going to have the biggest impact on the company? Which ones are going to stop runabout from meeting its overall objectives? These are the big strategic risks that need to be dealt with first. And also the ones that are very relevant to operations, such as IT risks and cybersecurity risks, which is a very important P3 subject. Just again, talking about risks from a very generic perspective and how organizations can manage risk by using models such as the COSO models and all this thing, and talking about internal environment and control environment and all those theoretical parts is not going to help you get marks in that particular activity. You need to tie all the risks back to the strategy, tie the risks back to the company's position, how we can mitigate those risks, what's an effective way to mitigate it. You can't just say that all risks should be mitigated and we'll do whatever it takes to mitigate them, because we have to balance the risk and the reward. We have to balance the cost of mitigating those risks. So it ties back with funding, it ties back with feasibility. That's what you need to do. And finally, recommend and maintain a sound control environment. So here we're talking about audit, another important P3 topic. And this is the one that CIMA have said is really useful for distinguishing the candidates that are applying the information effectively and those who aren't. So they said that the strong answers focused on the problems rising from the control environment and recommending realistic changes or audits that is going to address these problems. So what we mean here, this is one of the things that students often get wrong. They confuse control environment, they confuse audit with risk management. They are two different things. Risk management is identifying risks and putting controls in place. Audit is analyzing those controls to see if they are effective or not. It's not the job of audit to mitigate risk. It's the job of audit to make sure that controls are effective and that people are utilizing them effectively, that they are actually adhering to those controls that have been put in place. So that's a really fundamental, important, subtle but important distinction between recommend and maintain a sound control environment and evaluate risk. So those are the general gist of the different core activities. And again, you can see here that the weaker answers just listed out internal controls and governance features. They weren't tying it back to the risks that were supposed to be controlled, etc. And then we have some hints that the examiner has given you. And you'd be amazed at how many students will not look at these hints. They won't look at this report. And it seems like madness. The actual examiner, the person who's setting this exam, has given you hints and tips to perform better in the August 2020 exam. Why would you not look at it? So what we're going to do in this next half of the video is just to look through these hints and tips, which are both before the exams, what you need to do between now and August 2020 exam, and also what you should be doing during your exam. So the first thing here is to make sure that you know the syllabus, you know the content that is in those core activities, but not that you can just regurgitate it and use your theoretical knowledge, but you can actually apply it to these scenarios. So a good way of doing this would be to take your models, your pestel, etc., and work through the pre-scene, applying those models to the pre-scene. Therefore, you can use those models, use that theory effectively. And they've also gone on to say here in the second tip is to make sure you're familiar with the pre-scene, make sure you're familiar with your role and what is actually expected of you. Because often students, they answer it like a student rather than answering it like a senior manager at Runabout. And think about your audience. Think about who you are actually providing this information to. You're giving it to the board. What do the board want? They want nice, summarized, detailed information so they can make decisions. If they ask you to analyze a particular industry or analyze a particular project, they expect you to come in with a real recommendation. And that also ties in with 3 as well. So, are your recommendations logical? Are they properly justified? You must feel confident about them before submitting them to the board of directors, as if you were submitting it to your actual board of directors and your actual job that you actually have. Board of directors don't want raw data. They want you to come in with a nice presentation, summarize information, and a recommendation why we should go ahead with this or why we shouldn't go ahead with this. They don't want you to walk in there with a huge stack of spreadsheet printouts under your arm with lots of information, no real direction about it. Just dump it on the boardroom table and say, there you all are, make something of that. That's not what a director will want. So that's not what you should be providing in the actual exam. So also take time to look at some of the past strategic case study papers as well to see the kinds of questions that are being asked. So even though they won't be relevant, they won't be directly linked to this particular pre-scene, it will be relevant for the kinds of questions that you will receive in your exam. And finally, onto the tips of things to do during your exam. Make sure you answer the question. Make sure you tie everything back to the actual question that is being asked. So remember to relate it to the scenario. Don't be one of these candidates that doesn't relate it to the scenario. Make sure that you are tying everything you say back to the actual question requirement as well, even if it's just putting a little sentence in just to say exactly why this meets the question requirement. Because students will often skim read the question, they'll think this is what they're asking of me, and they'll just carry on like that. And the problem with that is it's inherently biased. Students will look for the question how they want it to look. They'll look to answer the question they want to answer, not the questions actually being asked. Now, I've had questions before when I've been marking scripts where it's been a question about analysing a particular project. And one of the reference materials was a net present value. And they told me everything about net present values and what they were and how they're calculated and why companies use them and how they're better than the alternative investment appraisal methods, etc. Okay, very good. It's all correct. And if it had been a question saying, analyze the different investment appraisal techniques and tell me why net present value is the best, it would have been a fantastic answer. But of course it didn't ask that. It asked you to analyze a project. You need to consider the strategy, the strategic fit of it, how it's going to be implemented, the feasibility of it, not just talking about the net present value. So always make sure you answer the question that is being asked. Again, don't forget that it may be necessary to answer in a manner that could prove unpopular. And this is another thing that students often do. The way the questions are asked is usually the finance director will come to you and say, this is the project I want you to look at. I think it's a good idea. Let me know what your thoughts are. So the student will already be setting out with a blinkered mindset that they have to justify this project. The director wants to do it. We need evidence of why it's a good thing for them to do. But actually, if you are analysing the information, think this is a really poor project idea, actually, it's not feasible, it's not in tune with our strategic fit, etc., then you have to say so. It's your role as a director or senior manager at this company to be honest, to be ethical, integrity. Think about your CIMA ethical principles. So always make sure that you are willing to go against what is being suggested by the directors. Also, make sure it's clear for the reader. Make sure that the examiner, the marker that's looking at your script, knows what you're talking about, where you're talking about. So make sure you use lots of headers, make sure you present it in nice, clear, direct language. They don't want to have to filter through a huge blob of text where 5 or 6 points are all muddled in together. Now, in an ideal world, they will obviously be able to pick those points out, but given that they've got hundreds to mark in a very short space of time, they don't want to have to be made to work really hard to find marks. So make sure you can set it out in a way that is very easy to read, very easy to give marks. Number 4, use your time wisely. There are 3 tasks, an hour allocated to each, and this is exactly what it is. It's 3 hours allocated across 3. You have 1 hour each. You do not have 3 hours overall, in the sense that if you finish with some time remaining, you can take that time over to the other one, or you can come back to it later. No, you can't do that. So make sure you use the entire hour, and make sure that if you do finish early, you use it to review and build upon your answers. And also spread your time out appropriately. If you've got 2 questions in this particular question, 2 subtasks, and one is worth 60%, one's worth 40%, spend 60% of your time on the first one, 40% of your time on the other. Don't spend 80% of your time on one, because then you're not going to get enough marks, because it says 60% of your time for a reason. You're only going to get 60% of the marks of it. And you earn more marks on average by starting a second subtask than you do by finishing off your other subtask, because you earn most of the marks you're going to get for a task in the first half of it. So if you've got 40 minutes to spend on one particular subtask, most of the marks you're ever going to get for that are going to be earned in that first 20 minutes. So with that in mind, it's not worth spending too long finishing it off rather than starting your second subtask, because in your second subtask, you'll earn most of your marks in the first half of it. And finally, make sure that you do use your industry examples. You do take a look at the industry examples. If you are an Astranti student, you may have the industry pack, which has got all the examples a part of it. But do make sure that you use ones that are effective, ones that are relevant, rather than just sticking ones in for the sake of it. But if you do use a few, it will prove to the examiner that you have at least done some outside research, and you are capable of tying this theoretical knowledge that you've learnt from your studies and also from the case study to the actual real world. Because ultimately the purpose of this strategic case study exam is to demonstrate that the student has reached the required level of knowledge and competence, etc., to basically be an effective management accountant in the real world. So the more you can demonstrate that, the better chance you have of passing. So thank you very much for watching this video. Hope you have enjoyed it and found it useful. You can find this document on the CIMA website if you want to learn more about it. Also, if you want to learn more about Astranti, then please visit the website www.astranti.com and like and subscribe at the bottom of the screen. You'll find many samples for our strategic case study exam. We have some sample videos, we have some sample study text as well, all of which has been designed to basically teach students the content and also analyze the pre-scene effectively, and provide them with some advice and tips and techniques on how to structure their answers properly so they can effectively and with time in mind read the question and come up with an appropriate plan and structure their answer effectively, and also write information that is clear, that is concise, that is direct, and is going to earn you marks. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now.